Hello and welcome to episode 4 of the Sci-Fi Podcast. From Bloomington, Indiana, I'm Nick Zoutra. We have a very special treat for you today, as this particular episode is the first ever recorded interview of the podcast, which took place back in October with Roberta Millstein, professor in philosophy at the University of California at Davis. I recorded this interview with the intention of having it up prior to the Philosophy of Science Association's biennial meeting, but unfortunately, due to a number of time constraints this semester, I was unable to get it up in time. So toward the end, you'll hear Roberta and I discussing the upcoming PSA meeting, of which I unfortunately was not able to attend, but of which I did hear was a tremendous success. And I hope to be at the 2018 meeting in Seattle, Washington when it takes place. So let me give you a little more introduction about Roberta. Once again, she is a professor in the Department of Philosophy at University of California, Davis. In addition, she is affiliated with the Science and Technology Studies program, the John Muir Institute of the Environment, and the UC Davis Interdisciplinary Animal Studies Research Group. She serves as editor of the peer-reviewed open-access online journal Philosophy and Theory in Biology. She is also on the executive committee and council for the AAAS Pacific Division, an elected member at large for the section on history and philosophy of science of the AAAS, and the senior co-chair of the Philosophy of Science Association's Women's Caucus. This is something we get to chat about during this particular interview. Roberta's research interests include the way that general topics in the philosophy of science, such as causation, mechanisms, probability, and determinism, illuminate and are illuminated by topics in evolutionary biology and ecology. She's also particularly interested in intersections between evolutionary biology, ecology, and environmental issues. Her recent work examines the concepts of fitness, population, and random drift, race and sexual selection, GMOs, and the so-called war in science, and connections between population genetics and ecology. She is currently working on projects exploring Patricia Gowitsky's adaptively flexible sex role model, on the importance of interconnectedness in Aldo Leopold's land ethic, and on the way that laboratory experiments, field experiments, and natural experiments can jointly inform us about ecological and evolutionary interactions. I think you will highly enjoy this informative and engaging talk that Roberta and I had. It was wonderful to hear her origin story as to how she came about getting into philosophy of science. And she actually has a very interesting story regards to moving and making the transition from graduate school to her first tenure-track position. This is something that I'm sure hopefully many of our listeners are genuinely interested in, how to succeed post-graduate school and how to look for those jobs. So I think Roberta has some very telling information and recommendations that would be worthwhile to listen to. So without further ado, let's bring in Roberta. So as you're learning to hike along a line, do you recall any kinds of questions that you had as a child? Certain things that interested you being out in nature?
Well, I think I was this sort of child that questioned pretty much everything.
I think if you're a philosopher, you pretty much have to question everything.
Exactly. This is the philosopher side of me. You just sort of wonder at all the assumptions that people make, and you wonder how it is that the things you see around you got to be this way. I mean, in part, how did evolution happen? But even more fundamentally, how, why is there even a Earth at all? Why is there anything at all? Those really basic questions that are so hard to answer.
And what was it like? Did you ever, having these questions, run to your parents or run to the friends or schoolmates with these kinds of questions? I know myself as a philosopher, I sometimes will, I recall as a young child having these big questions and running to other folks, and sometimes people being very excited and some being met with what are you thinking about again? Like, what is going on up there? And so you have, you kind of figure out like who's really excited about these questions, and then who is maybe not thinking about them.
Yeah. I think I mainly kept them to myself for the most part. Just a lot, things I would think about, books I would read. I read a lot of science fiction, and I think that helped me kind of think through some of these things. I know, and then I would ask my teachers all these questions, and sometimes they'd be happy to hear them, and sometimes not so much. So,
do you remember? Yeah. Do you have a favorite science fiction book that you enjoyed?
Well, let's see. I love Ursula Le Guin. I think she's my favorite science fiction author. And although it's not necessarily very science-y, I think The Dispossessed is my favorite book of hers. Just really gets you to think about other ways that our society could live. And there's certainly a science component too. It's both utopia and dystopia at the same time, and so it sort of shows our path and how it could lead. Might be leading down a bad direction. Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm not too familiar with it, but I'll definitely have to look into it a little bit. Oh, you have to check it out.
Yeah. Okay. I certainly will. I'm actually just pulling it up right now. Wow. Okay. Okay, great. So you're into science fiction. You're growing up in New Jersey, hiking, doing very involved in nature. In high school and growing up, were there what were you thinking about as far as going out in the world, choosing a profession? What were some of the options that you were thinking about?
I had absolutely no idea at all.
Yeah.
And I never knew how to answer it.
I can certainly relate. Or like you have ideas, but the idea of one or two things that you want to do is it's tough to. Yeah, I totally relate with that. Not having this one certain calling or something. So you started and went into Dartmouth. Mm-hmm. Okay, great. What were you majoring in? Do you recall the first years at Dartmouth?
Well, again, I had no idea what
Understandable, yeah.
Literally. Yeah. So I was just taking a lot of science classes. I took some philosophy classes. Basically, for the first 2 years, social science, I was just taking everything and trying to figure out what to do because I really just didn't know what to do.
Sure. Okay, so social sciences. Did what eventually brought you along? You think that philosophy sounded like a good idea? Well,
so at the end of your sophomore year, they make you pick a major, which God, what was that? And so I ended up picking two actually. So I picked computer science and philosophy, and those were they were really good balance for me having the two majors. The computer science was very pragmatic and very concrete, and the philosophy also used the same logical thinking as computer science, but in a more open and open-ended way. And so those were just, of all the courses that I had taken in my exploration, those were the two that appealed to me the most. And I guess in philosophy, what appealed to me in particular was just all those questions that I'd had growing up. Yeah. Finally, I learned that other people are asking them. Wow, that's great.
Yeah, and you can do this for a living. You can ask these questions and think about them. Yeah. That's great. Did you have a favorite class in undergrad?
Philosophy of science, by far.
Philosophy of science. Do you remember your teacher?
Professor Jim Moore.
Jim Moore. Okay.
Still there, I believe.
Really? Okay.
I think so.
Okay. And what made this philosophy of science class? How did you take it when you were like?
I'm sorry.
What made this class so enjoyable?
Well. So as I said, I've been taking all these science classes.
Yeah.
So, of course, I knew what the scientific method was. We all know, right, what the scientific method is. And then Professor Moore had us go through, sort of the typical, here's Hempel and here's Popper and gee, these things that sound like, kind of classic attempts to explain what the scientific method are actually don't work all that well. How can this be? And I was, beating my head, and then we read Kuhn and we read Feyerabend, and I thought, oh gosh, there just has to be an answer to this question of what the scientific method is. Because as I said, I sort of had this, science background and liked science.
Yeah.
So I was just really pulled in by how interesting of a problem that was. And it seemed like there ought to be a solution, but it wasn't any of the obvious ones. So that was, I think, that plus just the way that Professor Moore ran his classroom was fantastic. So those two things combined, I think, really drew me in, although it wasn't, I won't say it was a direct line from there to grad school. There was...
Fair enough. Yeah, we'll get there. Absolutely. Sure. I'm genuinely curious. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, as you're like many of undergraduates at the time, not knowing what we want to do, but having some interest in certain subjects, science, having this very large science background, were you considering ever going the way of a laboratory scientist or environmental scientist?
A mess in the laboratory.
Now, okay, that's what I've the description is a mess in the laboratory, something new. So tell me about that.
I'm not sure exactly what the problem was, but I think I was trying to be overly careful, So I'd be in chem lab and, trying to measure everything exactly, totally precisely. And I think I was the last person out of the room, and the experiments never worked anyway, and so I don't know. I was just cursed.
Those chem labs, I can remember them from high school, and I didn't have the opportunity to take them in college, but they were challenging at times.
Yes.
There's all these rules and all these step by steps. You have to do them the right way, and yeah, so I can certainly relate with that.
Yes, and then field biology, I didn't even really know that was an option. I kind of wish that I did. Maybe I would have gone that way. I don't know. But I didn't really realize that was an option.
Yeah, it's interesting how, so this is an interesting question. What was your perception, growing up of what a working scientist would do?
I think it was a scientist in the laboratory, right? That's our aim. The scientists, right? And you don't learn about the theoreticians, and you don't learn about the field scientists. You learn about the scientists in the lab. I thought that's all there was.
Yeah, I remember reading, in particular, did you ever read any of Carl Sagan's books? The kind of, I'm not sure. He had this...
sure, I've read some Carl Sagan.
Yeah, he's written, it's more like kind of some pop science-y books regarding, and I think he had one on the demon-haunted world.
Yes, I've read that.
Yeah, and it was particularly, I remember reading it in undergrad, and it describes the portrayal of the scientist as this kind of, this very expert lab coat wearing, it almost is this very dehumanizing picture of the scientist. And it really fails to give out the human aspect of the theoreticians or those who are actually working in the field. And in some ways it might give one, it adds in some ways credibility, but in some other ways discredits what it means to be a scientist. And it might almost discourage those who are genuinely interested in science from actually pursuing a science career. Right.
Someone like me who realizes they're no good at lab and then doesn't realize there are other things they could be doing that are still in science.
Yeah. And I think that's changing now. I think there's a little bit more introduction.
Good.
I'd have to ask. Okay, so you're working with computer science. You're doing philosophy of science, and you graduate. Okay, and it's straight to grad school, right?
Yeah.
No, yeah. So you graduate. What's going through your mind at that time?
Well, so at the time, it never really occurred to me that philosophy was something that I would do as a career. It just seemed obvious that, philosophy was this major I had done for fun, but computer science was the major that was going to be my career.
Yep.
And so I got a job in Boston as a software engineer and, started computer programming, type.
Great. What kinds of programs were you working on?
Oh God, it wasn't very interesting. I think it was accounting software, and I was sort of writing functions. How you would display the data.
Sure, yeah.
It wasn't that interesting.
Okay. And what were the languages at the time you were working with?
Oh, now you're really making me
think back.
It was Back's Basic.
Oh, okay.
Which was an advanced form of BASIC that used libraries and functions, if that means anything to you. So the original form of BASIC you really couldn't do very much with. So this was one they had developed that you could actually make real products with it, and they did. This company did.
Okay. So I'm not that familiar. I'm currently studying Python right now, and we're learning. It's more of a general computer programming course that is for cognitive scientists, actually. So our instructor is trying to teach us some of the basics regarding general programming. I'd be interested in a little bit more about BASIC maybe in the future to see.
Oh, I don't think there's program in BASIC anymore. I don't know.
Okay. Oh, yeah.
I'm not sure if you need to know.
That's fair.
The way they taught computer science at Dartmouth, I really appreciated it. They taught us the principles of computer programming and software engineering and operating systems and all that stuff. And then they said, look, computer languages are just things that you pick up along the way. And so if I have to, code in one language, I'll just learn that. But because I know the basic principles, I need to code in something else, I'll learn that. So it was, I thought, a very helpful approach.
Very nice. Great. So you finished and you left and you moved to Boston. Mm-hmm. How do you like it out there?
Not as much as I had thought that I would.
So was Boston, were you initially very excited to be, moving out of Jersey or out of Dartmouth and into Boston?
I was, yeah. I thought, I love to ski and I love the beach. And I thought, well, Boston's fantastic because you're not that far from the beach and you're not that far from skiing. And
where's they have a slopes up in Boston?
Well, I thought
kind of close.
It's a short drive up to New Hampshire from Boston.
Oh, okay.
I didn't realize was that every other person had the same idea, so weekend would come and there'd just be this massive outflow of traffic, either, to the slopes in the winter or to the beach in the summer. And so what I thought would be, reasonably accessible was just impossible.
Oh, geez. Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, the traffic in Boston is oof.
Sorry, I don't mean to insult any Bostonians, but
that's okay. I think we're okay. I think you're safe here. If there's anyone listening from Boston, I'm sorry. So you're in Boston. How long were you in Boston for?
Only about 7 months.
Oh wow. Okay. So you worked for an accounting. Was it an accounting firm, or you were working in software engineering with accounting software?
Yes.
Okay. Great. So you're thinking about that, not liking it a whole lot, and now is this at the time where you're considering going back to school, or what is what's going through your mind now?
Yeah. Well, so I'm sitting behind the computer. Sure. And looking at the clock and looking at the clock some more and realizing that this thing that I like to do, which is program computers, and I still do enjoy that.
Yeah.
I don't like to do it all the time. I learned I don't like to do it all day, every day.
Sure.
And so I was sitting there and I thought, and it was really the first time I had even seriously considered it. I thought, I could go back to grad school. I could do philosophy. I could be sitting around talking about philosophy instead of sitting behind this computer by myself. I mean, the way that East Coast programming worked back then was very different from sort of the image of Silicon Valley that you have today, which is very collaborative. Our company was not collaborative at all, so you really were just sitting behind the computer all the time. And yeah, I thought I could be in a room with philosophers talking about philosophy, and that would be a lot better.
That's interesting, the East Coast programming. I feel like maybe that was, so you did have this idea of this idle, isolated programmer growing up, or at least that was the initial thing. And then, do you think that, so now is it, I guess you would call it the West Coast Silicon Valley programmer who has become, yeah, that's interesting. I wonder, yeah, do you have any insight on how that might have emerged or how that transition kind of came around?
I think it just has to do with differences between the East Coast and West Coast more generally. I mean, even the way that people dressed. I mean, I used to go to work in a suit, or at least a nice skirt and heels.
Yeah, sorry to laugh. No, yeah, that's just so the opposite of what we've come to expect now. Sure, but that makes sense. You're going to a place of business.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, great. So you're thinking about philosophy. So did you then decide to apply?
I did, yes. Let's see. So, I was there about 7 months, and I thought, okay, time to put applications in. So, of course, it was another year then before I was able to go. So it was about 2 years out.
Okay.
I was, 2 years in between undergrad and grad school.
Great. And I see you were admitted to the University of Minnesota.
Yes.
Great. And were you in their History of Science and Philosophy of Science program?
Yes. So I was in the philosophy department, and then Minnesota required you to have a minor, and so I had a minor in History of Science and Technology, and there's also the Center for History and Philosophy of Science there, and so I was part of the activities of the center when I was there.
Wow, okay. And yeah, so I've heard Minnesota is a pretty big hub, or they have a pretty decent program with history and science and philosophy of science. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and how was that back in the early 90s?
It was really good. We had kind of a cohort of grad students that took classes together. So we had the historians taking the philosophy classes and vice versa. And, again, going to the symposia together. Mm-hmm. And, so it was always interesting sort of alternating between the history talks and the philosophy talks. And I'm still in touch with some of those people, some of the historians I've met at that time. It was a really good, really kind of positive environment.
Oh, that's great. And was this your first exposure to doing history?
I suppose it was, yeah. Now that I think about it, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So, and if you're minoring in history of science, so when you started working with there, did you right away jump into a philosophy of science approach, or was there an integrated HPS, history and philosophy of science, push there?
Well, it was sort of. I wouldn't say there was an integrated HPS approach, because it wasn't an HPS department. So you were taking classes in the philosophy department, but Minnesota was so strong in philosophy of science, there were actually a lot of classes to take. And then, as I said, then I would pick up the history of science classes in addition. So the integrated part was something that I think happened more organically between students crossing the two areas, and again, as I said, the Center for History and Philosophy of Science, that also promoted it. But the program itself was not an HPS program, not the way Indiana is.
Sure. Okay. And so you mentioned so you met a really good group of folks there, and you said you keep in touch with a few of them. Mm-hmm. Great. Philosophers, historians.
Some of both, and also some of the ones that even came after me. So,
okay.
So, two of my professors who ended up being my advisors were Ken Waters and John Beatty, and both of them had done a really good job of keeping me in touch with the people that came after. Although actually now neither of them are at Minnesota anymore, but they both were there for quite a while after I left.
Yeah, I've met John Beatty. He's a great guy. He's at UBC. Is that?
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. So you work with him. I see a dissertation advisor, or
Mm-hmm.
on one of the committees? Okay, great.
Yes, both him and Ken were my co-advisors. Ken Waters.
Okay. And so you're working on you're in the philosophy of science. Do you, if you recall, how did you come about working toward your dissertation topic?
Well, so first I had to be even drawn to philosophy of biology.
Yeah.
Something that both Ken and John had a hand in. So Ken came to the program maybe my second year, I think, and taught philosophy of biology, which I hadn't had any exposure to up until that point at Darwin.
Yeah, just so far you had a general philosophy of science course where folks, you learn about just generally how science works and some of the issues concerning it.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, so I, took this philosophy of biology course from Ken and just opened my eyes to all these questions about natural selection and fitness and evolution and processes of evolution, and I was really hooked. Ken just made it seem so exciting and so important. And then I took this Darwinian Revolution class from John Beatty, and again I was just blown away. It was just really interesting learning about Darwin and how many to read Darwin and see how many of his ideas are still being hashed out today. How many things he anticipated, the questions he asked. It's fascinating for me. So between the two of them, I was completely hooked on philosophy of biology. Yeah.
So as opposed to it seems like happenstance. You happen to take these great classes, and they happen to be phenomenal instructors, and they so happen to get you interested. And so you found like this philosophy of biology. This is what you wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. And so, what kind of questions for then your dissertation were you genuinely interested in?
So I was really interested in understanding. So my dissertation was on the role of chance in evolution.
Okay.
But it might as well have been on the role of causation in evolution.
Okay.
It's interested in both chance and causation, and was trying to get at causation by looking at chance, if that makes sense. So, in other words, I wanted to understand it by what it was contrasted with. And it seemed to me really important because, so I remember reading, we had read something by Elliot Sober where he says, fitness is causally inert in the theory of evolution. And I thought, well, what does that mean? What are the implications if fitness is causally inert, if we can't say that, these organisms out-reproduce these other organisms because they were fitter, and that's playing a causal role, right? That really, oh gosh, that could raise some problems, right? If we can't distinguish, does that mean that we can't distinguish then, chances from causes? So that was sort of my impetus. I think my original impetus for writing the dissertation was trying to sort that out, and then it broadened from there as dissertations do.
Sure. And so, what are some basic examples of sorting out, for example, a chance in evolution and a cause in evolution?
Sure. So, so imagine if you had a population, let's say, of butterflies, and they're red and green. I'm stealing this example from John Hodge. So butterflies, red and green, and there's a predator that's eating the butterflies, but the predator is colorblind, can't tell the difference between red and green, right? It could happen that in one generation that you see an increase in the green over the red. But that isn't because the green are fitter than the red.
Sure.
It's by chance, because, again, the predator is colorblind. And so then contrast that with a case where the predator can discriminate between the red and the green. And, maybe there's, red backgrounds and green backgrounds, and that's going to affect, the prevalence of red and green backgrounds, that's going to affect which ends up being fitter in the environment. If it's a largely green environment, then the green ones are going to be fitter. So working to kind of, and that's the distinction I'm just trying to draw there is between natural selection and random drift. So trying to characterize that distinction. And of course, I should let you know, I've characterized that in a particular way that, other philosophers might take issue with. So you might say, well, what's the problem? Well, Of course, I've characterized it in a way so that the answer to the problem seems clear, right? There's a clear difference between those two cases.
Sure. Yeah, and so you mentioned though that there has been some. Have you had some responses that people have responded to your work who have disagreed?
Sure. So in writing this is just this is a case of coincidence or chance. I ended up getting caught up into what's been called the statisticalist debate or statisticalist dynamic debate. It gets called different things because it turned out there were, kind of simultaneously, coincidentally, a group of philosophers who wanted to argue that natural selection was purely statistical, that it's not a process at all and certainly not a causal process.
Oh, wow.
That there are causes, individual births and deaths, but, that you just sum those up and then that's natural selection, so it's not at all causal. So I inadvertently got drawn into that discussion. And it's like many debates, got multiple prongs to it. But, yeah. And just recently, though, this has been kind of exciting for me because this is something that, I really started my career with and hadn't really worked on for a little while. But just recently, I did a Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on genetic drift. And
wow! Yeah,
it was exciting for me to finally kind of reflect back on, the last 20 years, basically, and where's the debate gone, and what are the issues, and it was really the first time I'd had a chance to sort of sit down and think through all that.
Yeah, and for those of us who don't know, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is a great encyclopedia which brings in prominent philosophers to write on particular subjects of their expertise at a level above that of, let's say, Wikipedia or something. What's it like writing one of those?
As I said, I found it to be a lot of fun. I think it maybe depends on what stage you're at. Maybe if you'd asked me to write it 10 years ago, I wouldn't have been happy to do it, but it really forced me to think, well, what are the kind of the main issues, and how do I lead the reader in? And it gave me an opportunity to talk about some of the history of the use of the term genetic drift, and that was really fun. I really enjoyed getting to do that. Some of that hadn't been done before, and so I was happy to be able to incorporate that into the entry. Yeah.
So it's a little bit of a preview. How has it been used in recent history?
I'm sorry?
How has the term genetic drift been used?
Well, there have been a lot of debates among biologists about it.
Oh.
And throughout the 20th century, and even, I'd say, continuing today, that, there's been this question about just, if we're going to talk about the trajectory of a population through time and the way it changes over time, what's causing those changes? Are those changes being caused by natural selection, right? That's, what most of us hear about when we hear about evolution. Or, are other processes like genetic drift, are they prevalent? And there's been a lot of disagreements over the decades between biologists about that, on that topic, and different ways that they've tried to answer the question, because it often even if you can distinguish between the processes of drift and selection, which I happen to think you can, it's often difficult to discriminate between the outcomes. And so it's difficult to know when you're just looking at a population, well, what's happened here, right? What were the causes that operated to bring it to this point? That turns out to be a difficult question for biologists to answer. So it's been pretty controversial.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you're working on this, I mean, how would you say, how often are you speaking with biologists?
Whenever I can, whenever they're interested in talking to me.
And how do you introduce yourself?
Well, as a philosopher of science, philosopher of biology, and they want to know, do you know your stuff? Are you familiar with some of the major figures, and do you know the right terminology, and all those typical questions?
Sure. Oh, that's great. And so you wrote the dissertation. Did you go? So where did you end up after graduate school?
I ended up teaching at what was then called Cal State Hayward, now called Cal State East Bay. And I was there for about 9 years teaching there.
Wow. Okay. So a tenure-track position over there?
Yes. Well, I guess it was a lecturer my first year. So I got very lucky.
Tell me. Yeah. For those of us still on the job market and on the job hunt, we're generally interested in how folks like yourselves land those jobs.
You don't want to hear this story because I got really, really lucky.
Okay, that's fair. I've heard it's a little bit of chance.
Yeah, I just was really just in the right place at the right time. So I was living in California. I had moved out here to write my dissertation, and was living with my partner out here. And,
great.
I finished up the dissertation, and I thought, now what? I'd sort of finished it at an awkward time and hadn't gotten a job the previous year.
Mm-hmm.
And a friend of mine suggested, well, look, there's a lot of these, CSUs and community colleges in the area, Cal States and community colleges. Just draw a radius and send your CV out. And maybe they have some, part-time work, which was the best piece of advice that nobody else had told me.
Yeah, you don't really hear too much about that.
No. None of my professors. I love my advisors, as I said, but I don't think they thought to suggest that. So this was a fellow graduate student who'd, lived in California, and so sort of knew, that there were a lot of universities looking for part-time professors. And it never occurred to me to send my CV to a place that didn't have a job advertisement, but a lot of these places kind of have a pool of lecturers that they draw on when they need someone. And it just so happened that Cal State Hayward just had a retirement of the person that did philosophy of science, and so they needed a part-time person to fill in for his classes. And then in my first month there, they announced, and by the way, we're going to be hiring a tenure track in philosophy of science. Like,
oh my gosh.
And they said, we don't promise that you'll get this job, but I think it helped that they knew me and they knew my teaching, and so I was very, very lucky. And to get a job, tenure track job relatively quickly out of grad school and living in the area that I had been living in, and nice area.
Yeah, where in California?
Where was that? The Hayward, California is south of Oakland.
Okay, so a little parts of Northern California. Yeah,
it's still Northern California. Yeah, it's east side of the Bay, so east of San Francisco.
Okay.
And we were living in the South Bay, so it was a little bit of a commute for me, but
how do you like it out there? How do you like living in Northern Cal? I suppose you live around the same area now in Davis. It's how far away?
About maybe an hour and a half away from where in the Bay Area. Yeah, it's nice. I like it. It's a good place to live.
Yeah, that's great. So you're living there, working lecturer to assistant professor, teaching philosophy of science.
Yes, philosophy of science and a little history of science, environmental ethics, biomedical ethics. I was teaching a lot of classes at Cal State. I had a 3-3-3 teaching load.
Oh, okay. Was it so? It was more of a kind of an in between teaching and research focus, or
exactly.
Because I know, it seems like some of the schools have a 2-2 load, which the more are probably like Davis, I would imagine. And then, or maybe I guess you're on the quarter system there. So what is the requirement actually? So
we teach 4 courses over 3 quarters.
Okay.
Which is really rather nice because you can do 2 in one, 2 in another, and then 0 in the third quarter.
Oh yeah, that's great.
It's a good position.
Yeah. So in a sense, you kind of get an extended summer. When you,
yes. I mean, it can vary.
Or with teaching,
you get off, but
sure.
Yeah, you get more.
Yeah, you could have one in the middle, which might even be, preferred.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So you're working there. Are you following up? Are you getting deep into philosophy of biology, or is this time is when you start branching off into ethics?
No, I think I was still doing philosophy of biology my whole time there. I think it's been more recent that I've branched off into ethics.
Yeah. Okay. Great. And so, and then, about 9 years passes, and what drew you to Davis?
Well, it's a really good place to do philosophy of biology. Jim Griesemer is here.
Yes, I met Jim.
He's a great colleague. And we have a philosophy of biology lab group that meets once a week, graduate students. And so having that opportunity to talk about philosophy of biology with other philosophers of biology once a week and teach classes in philosophy of biology, it was a way to bring my research and teaching a little closer together and just have more of a philosophy of biology community.
Yeah, I can see. I brought up your lab page right now. So for typically, if you're a scientist, a science lab consists of a physical location with instruments, experiments. But a philosopher's lab is a little bit different. So how does your guys' lab work?
Well, so think about if you were. Each scientist was sort of off doing their own experiment, and then they might meet once a week and, sort of say, so, how are things going with you? And, what are you working on? And they'd share what they're working on. So in a way we do that, or that's at least one of the things that we do, is to share what we're working on and give each other suggestions and talk about work in progress and get ideas for how to go forward, or even the later stages where you've got now a full draft of a paper, but maybe you need comments, or maybe you want to present your work, do a practice run through before a conference. So those are some of the types of things, and it's partly meant to support the graduate students. In fact, I'd say that's the main purpose of the lab, but it also ends up, I think, being good for me and Jim as well. It's a really nice. It's a really nice group, and it's continued to be a nice group as its composition has changed over time. It's a good.
I think that's really good. No, I think a supportive group such that, having a focus on the students, the graduate students as well, is really good. But as far as you and Jim, I think anyone can benefit from being in a part of group, like a focus group like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, great. And so you've been at Davis since 2006. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. And so, have there been any particular papers or particular ideas with which you've been, very excited about in your tenure over there?
Mm-hmm. So I'm really excited lately about this work I've been doing on Aldo Leopold and the land ethic.
Yeah, I'm genuinely. Yeah, I'm curious about that. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So I've been teaching environmental ethics for many years. As I said, I taught it at East Bay, and now I teach it at Davis. And I guess what originally sparked me was there had been this kind of classic interpretation of Leopold that never really sat very well with me, that sort of read him as, relying on Darwin's sociobiology and Humean ethics and things like that. Mm-hmm. And there was one day happened to be, see, chance again, it's everywhere. I happened to be teaching my environmental ethics class the same day I was teaching a philosophy of biology class and reading Darwin. And it suddenly hit me that, this kind of classic interpretation of Leopold had the wrong Darwin, that it wasn't talking about Darwin's ethics at all, that it was actually talking about Darwin as an ecologist. And that really, it excited me. It excited the HPS person in me, because there was this opportunity to think about historical Leopold and historical Darwin, but then also make sense of really the whole basis for Aldo Leopold's land ethic.
Yeah.
And then once I started down that route, then I started to realize, well, there's actually a lot of other things here for someone who's interested in history of philosophy of science to do, thinking about, so what sort of entity does the land ethic, give value to? Is that an ecosystem? Is that a community, or something in between?
Yeah.
So there were these, HPS type questions, but, then also the ethics questions of, I think, have always been of interest to me. And so, thinking about, well, again, can this new interpretation that I'm trying to put forward can that, how does that work then in terms of rethinking the whole land ethic more generally, right? And how do you justify a land ethic under this new interpretation? So it's meant to be a large project that I've been working on in little pieces. So, and hopefully at some point it'll all come together.
I'm very excited. Yeah, and I actually have the paper right here. We actually, for the biology studies reading group at Indiana, we read over the paper last semester, I believe. And yeah, so it's a up and coming paper. Are you turning this particular work into a book length type work, or what are you thinking?
I hope to at some point. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would like to.
Okay, great. Yeah, so this is this your main project right now, or is there anything else you're particularly interested in?
There are some other things that I've written on recently that I also want to get back to. I don't want to do them. So I've written a little bit recently in biology and race, philosophy of race, and I'd like to get back to that. And also some work on GMOs and values, science and values, and I'd like to get back to that as well. So
wow, so
all these projects.
Wow, yeah, no, this is so all in the realm of philosophy of biology, but some interesting things. Well, I imagined, are there any ties with ethics related with philosophy of race, biology of race, or GMOs?
Well, sure.
I mean, obviously there is, but I'm curious with your particular.
Yeah. So, very, very clearly with race.
Yeah.
There have been a lot of arguments. Are there races? What is our concept of race? And a lot of people think that those have implications for how we treat one another. That if we say that there are no races, what does that mean? Either way, it has implications for how we treat one another, right? Whether you say that there are no races, right, then people say, well, wait a second. If there are no races, then how do I make sense of the fact that this group of people is being discriminated against, right? You have to say something, it seems like. So there are certainly ethical implications there. And then with GMOs, I've been particularly interested in thinking about the environmental issues. It's the health issues that get the most play, but I think that's caused people to overlook, what happens when you grow GMOs out in the world, right? What does that do to the rest of the environment, and what are the both direct and indirect effects of that? That's one of the things I've tried to highlight. Yeah,
that's really fascinating. I think that's a keen observation regarding with folks maybe justifiably or unjustifiably tend to think of themselves as far as the health concerns, and less so, I think, and a distant second, I would say, comes in with the environmental concerns of GMOs. And then especially with GMOs, there is the backlash of, if you are pro-science, you are seemingly for GMOs. And there's somewhat of an ethical concern regarding just what side with which you are to, or how you are to interact in this kind of literature, or with this kind of presence. Have you come across that at all?
Well, so this is, I think, what really drew me in. There was a couple years ago, there was a movement in California, which failed, but to have GMOs labeled. Sure. And a lot of the rhetoric that was going around was saying, well, if you want GMOs labeled and if you have concerns about GMOs, then you're anti-science. Yeah. And that really, like, wait a second. The concerns about GMOs are actually well grounded in science, but that's one of the main pieces of rhetoric that they use. They try to brand you and say, well, if you've got concerns about GMO, you're just like the climate science deniers and the creation scientists, and they paint you all
anti-vaxxer or something, or
exactly, anti-vaxxers, right? And that made me blow my stack. So that was one of the things that originally motivated me to write about GMOs.
Wow, no, that's really interesting. That's really great. Well, great. So it sounds like you have a lot of fun projects coming up and in the works. We'll be looking forward to those. So yeah, the last thing I'm curious about is just, philosophy of science as a whole. This is a discipline that not a lot of folks know about outside of philosophy. How do you, how do you see it, as it is now, and, how do you see it going forward?
Interesting. So I think, one of the tensions that's really been in the field for quite a while is the sort of this basic question of how do we do philosophy of science, right? Do we do it from a very informed perspective where we're kind of knee-deep in the science and knee-deep in the history of science, or is it closer to the rest of philosophy where it's a little more a priori, let's say?
Sure.
And I think even today you see, you go to the Philosophy of Science Association conference and you'll see both types of work being done. And I think it's and of course it's a continuum, right? You find all kinds of, the extremes and all kinds of people in the middle. So I think there's this real question of where the field will go. Will one of these win out? Will it split? Will it? Will there be a reconciliation? And I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question, but it's something I've really watched happen. And I think I thought in the beginning when I started that this, more sort of grounded in the science approach would win out, but I don't see that it has. I think that, both ways of doing it are still going pretty strongly. Yeah,
I recall coming across a book for, something, I forget the exact title. It's something toward a naturalized philosophy of science. Mm-hmm. You're probably like in the 90s, I believe it came out, and there was a number of philosophers who wrote contributing to that. A lot of philosophers.
I think that's the Werner Calibut volume.
Yeah. And so sort of arguing for this is how philosophy of science ought to be done, or this is the way with which. Do you happen to know some of those philosophers of science on the other end who are not so grounded in the sciences?
Sure.
Or you happen to know, is there any of them you particularly have found interesting or have taken issue with, perhaps?
Well, I think my sympathies are pretty clear. Which side? Which side I come down on? I mean, they're nice people. They're doing interesting work. But, I think in the end we want to be clear about what it is that we're doing. Are we doing philosophy of science? And by science, do we mean, science as practiced? Or are we doing something else? And maybe that something else is something that's very worthwhile to do. But maybe it isn't really philosophy of science. Maybe it's something closer to epistemology or something. So,
sure.
Again, very worthwhile endeavor. So,
yeah, sure.
But again, my biases are clear here. So.
Yeah, and and I know this is a dilemma that's not going to be solved necessarily soon. Whether and it will be interesting to see what ways in which this goes. Mm-hmm. Will you be going to the PSA this year?
Yes, I will.
And this is the Philosophy of Science Association meeting, which will be happening in Atlanta sometime in November. Great. Are you giving a talk or just attending?
Yes. So I'm in a session that's going to be talking about interdependence, the concept of interdependence. So it's a philosophy of ecology session, and where my piece of it is going to be again tied to my project with Aldo Leopold. So thinking about what did Leopold mean by interdependence? And I think there's been some confusion on that score and exactly, whether, if Leopold claims that humans are interdependent with other species, what does that mean? Does that mean that if we say they depend, do they really depend on us? In what way do they depend on us? And so trying to sort out because there's been some challenges to that. So.
Oh, okay, great. Is it a panel, or will it be over related talks, or will it be?
It's a symposium, so the related talks they'll all be on interdependence. That's our theme. But I guess interdependence, also a number of the talks thinking about causation, thinking about generality in ecology. That's a perennial issue in ecology, that a lot of the explanations you come up with seem very particular and very relevant maybe to one system but not relevant to another system. And then understanding explanation in ecology becomes complicated. So that's, I think, another theme that will come out of our session.
Well, great. I plan to be there, so I'm looking forward. I'll definitely try to make time to see that.
Excellent.
Great. So one of the things I was curious about is, I imagine in doing this work, you've been doing some good reading. And if you have any reading recommendations, anything you've happened to have read. They could be books, could be just popular books as well, or any articles you might have come across.
That's a tough one. Also, I guess I'll just say, read Leopold's Assam County Almanac and read the whole thing, and then read some of the things that he wrote. Because one of my beefs with the scholarship is focusing too much on just this one essay, and sometimes focusing on two sentences of one essay. And so read the whole thing and just read it to enjoy it, because that's, I think, how it was intended to be read, as immersing yourself into the natural world and appreciating the natural world. I think that was important for Leopold.
Well, that is an excellent recommendation. It sounds like something that, something that definitely worthwhile to take on. Mm-hmm. Well, great, Roberta. I think we've covered a lot of ground in our chat. Is there anything else? Anything else you wanted to talk about, or anything else currently exciting you wanted to share?
Well, I did want to make a bit of a plug for the Philosophy of Science Association.
Yeah, absolutely.
Women's Caucus in particular.
Okay, great.
So I have been the senior co-chair of the Women's Caucus for the last 4 years. I'm going to be stepping down the end of my 4-year term. And I think it's been a really exciting development in the Philosophy of Science Association having this caucus. And we have now 2 prizes that we offer, one in feminist philosophy of science, and we also having a prize symposium this year for a symposium that is about the work of women and involves women and involves themes that women have been interested in, and that's going to be on Saturday morning. So I want to encourage people to go to that if they're in Atlanta and at the conference. And I just think the caucus has been good in a lot of ways. We've really pushed the PSA to offer childcare options for people who are traveling to the conference with children and who often find it hard to make sessions. And we've put together a blog. It's called Science Visions. My co-chair, Julia Burston, has really worked hard to make Science Visions flourish, and so I encourage people to check out Science Visions. That's
great. And what kind of blog? What do you guys do on the blog?
Anything that might be of interest to a philosopher of science or a woman philosopher of science. Thinking about what would it be like? One of the posts is, what would it be like to do a syllabus with all women? What would that look like? And would that work? Does it make sense? Or thinking about, just could not even be some issues not necessarily directly relating to women per se, but science and values has been a topic that a lot of feminist philosophers of science have written about. So some of the blog posts deal with that. So check it out.
All right.
So I just wanted to plug the Women's Caucus, because I think it's been a really great movement, and I hope that it continues, and I think it will.
Yeah, I'm very excited to hear what you guys come about. Are you guys doing? So it will be a meeting on Saturday morning.
Yes.
And you'll discuss. I imagine. Are there are there events or things throughout the year, or is this a biennial thing that just you guys come together? Or,
yeah, right now it's really just the biennial thing. We have our biennial meeting, which is always with the PSA. We have our morning breakfast, and it has a meet and greet component. We always try to make this partly. I think the original impetus for the caucus was really just, look, there aren't that many women doing philosophy of science. We should at least all know each other.
Yeah, let's get to know each other. Come on, let's have breakfast and then do some work together.
Right, exactly. So there's that. Yeah. So right now we're not doing anything else during the year other than these getting people to submit things for prizes and the blog, and we have a Facebook page. You can check out our Facebook page. So, those kinds of things we do in between, but we don't meet in between.
Sure.
And that would be fun to do. Maybe that's something that the future co-chairs can think about.
Well, I just think having a supportive group, related to your work and what you do, and maybe doing something in between, but even just having this is great. I think it's a phenomenal thing, and I'm excited to see. And how long has it been going for, actually?
I believe this will be our 10th year.
Great. Okay. All right. Well, that is fantastic. Well, Roberta, again, it's been a great pleasure chatting with you.
It's good to chat with you too.
Yeah, and I hope this semester. How is this? I didn't even ask. How's this semester panning out for you?
It starts. Well, today, really, but my first class tomorrow. We're on the quarter system, so.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. We've been in 5 weeks going, so we've been going five weeks strong. It feels like it just started last week, but
I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Sometimes I'm not sure about the merits of the quarter system versus the semester. Which wins out? But
pros and cons.
What's that?
Pros and cons.
Pros and cons. Yes. Okay. All right. Well, that about wraps it up. But it was a pleasure talking to you, Roberta, and we'll be in touch. And I look forward to seeing you at the Philosophy of Science Association meeting.
Fantastic. Likewise.
Okay. Thanks. Have a good rest of the day. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay. Take care.